Just been watching an interview on CNN on the Anderson Cooper 360 show. He's interviewing, in fact, the interview's ongoing right now, but there's a particular aspect I want to cover. There's a multitasking here. I'm reading newspapers and tidying up a bit. He's interviewing a guy called Michael Lewis, who's the author of The Fifth Risk, looks at, as he puts it, the sort of all-knowing factor um, of fear. People know, people can contextualize something like a nuclear attack or a large scale terrorist attack, but something like a pandemic is a different context. Anyway, he's interviewing this guy about that, and they're talking about Donald Trump and Trump's response to all of this, and they're getting into the issue of racism. Now, this has become quite a contentious aspect of this pandemic, um, and I think there's a few things going on at play here. In this interview, they're talking about how Trump's rhetoric, insofar as calling it the Chinese virus, is stoking up racism. Um, I'm not sure about that. I think it probably doesn't help, but I also think that the left need to be careful not to play into the Chinese regime's hands. What I mean by this is there is very legitimate criticism to be made of the way the Chinese government has handled this, and that should not be conflated with the real problem of racist attacks against East Asians. And I think this discussion, they were making fair points about Trump's handling of this. I mean, this is a man who has kind of made it the popular thing to mistrust experts. And we've seen that in the UK as well with Mr. Farage. It's kind of become popular. It's one of these aspects of populism that experts are part of the deep state and they're not to be trusted. They're part of the establishment. But this is one time we absolutely need to be listening to experts, virologists in particular. I mean, everyone and their uncle is forming an opinion on this thing. I'm not a virologist. Some people, I've had sort of inbox messages saying, Nathan, what do you think of this? What do you think of that? The truth is, people, I can only say what I observe. I am not a virologist. I'm not qualified to talk about this in great detail. So the things I've been saying are things that I've already read. In fact, I'll just show you the screenshot here. So that interview is ongoing. I just want to say it in reference. Um, but this is one time we absolutely need to be listening to experts. But I also think it is one time where, particularly in the United States, I think there's many legitimate criticisms to be made of the Trump presidency and how Trump has handled this. But I'm not sure that the racist thing is one of them. Because if you're saying Trump is stirring up racism against the Chinese, I think that kind of plays into the Chinese regime's hands of associating criticism of the Communist Party with the ugly racist sentiments against ordinary Chinese. Now, Trump, I have not seen Trump actually advocate and blame the Chinese people. His response in cutting off incoming flights is a response that many governments are taking. And this guy, Mr. Lewis, who's written this book, is saying that that doesn't make a difference. The problem is internal contact. That's probably true. However, surely having restrictions on people traveling from country to country is a practical step. And I don't think you can say that because it may be focused on Chinese flights, that is somehow racist. That's the country of origin. So surely that's practical, not racist. So I think, to be honest, this is CNN, so there's a degree of bias going on here, culture wars. He's Trump, so he's awful no matter what he does. I do think that Trump's ignorance, Trump's bombastic rhetoric, Trump's stubbornness and listening to the experts and sort of dismissing them and making this about. I mean, I think Trump's handling of this has, for the most part, been pretty bad. And I think that they've just got the update there. The United States has 18,000 cases, 242 deaths. In the UK, it's about 4,000 cases and 177 deaths, the last count. But the point here is, just got to take a screenshot of that actually. Let's see. On the racism issue, it is irrefutable that there has been ugly racist incidents against Chinese nationals and anyone of East Asian appearance. We've had a lot in the UK. One is one too many, but we have had quite a few of these. You know, people of East Asian appearance being targeted. Um, and frankly, someone on the right have been in denial about this. They say, oh, you can't say it's anything to do with racism. But if someone of East Asian appearance is being attacked physically or they're having abuse thrown at them and people are shouting out coronavirus or take your virus home, only a complete and utter fool would try and claim that isn't racial in intent. Of course it is. So, whilst I think that the term racism can be sometimes thrown around, I also think that there are too many on the right who are in denial that it is a problem. And I will say that those people doing that are Cooper's right about that. They're idiots. That's despicable. No one should be stigmatized because of where they're from in that sense. If people are being reckless, let's say, for example, you have Chinese individuals who are refusing to quarantine or something like that, that's a different matter. But if you're just generically smearing all Chinese, that's racism by definition. And I will always oppose that mentality. But I also think this is not a time to be playing the culture wars. This is not a time for the Democrats to be saying, oh, terrible Trump, look how racist he is. They need to be certainly focusing on the answers in terms of how they would do it better, but also in terms of recognizing that it was the Chinese Communist regime's cover up of this that helped the pandemic spread. That is the source. Um, and because of their attitude, the rest of the world is paying for it because they decided to cover this up and to punish the doctors who first diagnosed it. Now, I do believe that individual governments should be judged on their own response to the pandemic. And like I say, I think Trump's attitude has been far from statesmanlike. Um, Not just in calling it the Chinese virus. I think that was a bit blunt. It's not technically wrong because it originated in China. And by the way, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, why not call the 2009 swine flu the American virus? Well, the first case of that was actually diagnosed in Veracruz, Mexico. And at the time, it was actually known as the Mexico flu. There have been other pandemics and outbreaks that have had been named after the source. So, for example, in 1972, apparently, there was something called the London flu. It was on a much smaller scale than this, but it was thought to have originated in the UK and it was diagnosed. I hadn't even heard about this until a few days ago. Um, Spanish flu is the most obvious. Spanish flu. Now, I do wonder what the Spaniards think of that. Do they resent the world's deadliest modern pandemic being named after their country? Spain actually had 300,000 deaths out of a global total of up to 100 million. So by no means was Spain more affected than other countries. The only reason it's known as the Spanish flu is because the Spanish press at the time was more open. Because in the midst of World War One, or in the closing stages of World War One, French, British, German press were all censored in a way that the Spanish press wasn't. So we don't really know where that originated. It may, in fact, have originated from Kansas. That's one of the theories that came from I assume it would be Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, but no one really knows for sure. But the point I'm making there is to those Chinese who are saying, "Oh, it's calling it this Chinese flu is picking on China." I would argue that point because there are plenty of examples of other pandemics having the country of origin in the name, or at least a country associated with it. So why do we not say that the Spanish flu is bigoted against Spain and the Spanish people, given that it probably didn't originate there? I don't know, maybe the Spanish do resent that, but I haven't seen much of that. So I think it's a bit of a thin argument to say calling it the Chinese flu equals racism against China. Picking on ordinary Chinese equals racism. But what I do see a danger here where there's this obsession with racism is actually deflecting criticism from the Communist Party because they have certainly jumped on that. They've certainly said that Western governments are promoting racism, which is a baseless claim. Even if you take Trump's bombastic rhetoric as evidence of that, you certainly can't say that the British government's restriction on flights is racist, or the French, or the Italians. My student actually said to me, I mean, we've had this, we've talked a lot about the virus, and I'm a little bit wary because I need these lessons. So I don't want to get into a situation where I get into a heated debate with my student about this because I can see the sort of things he's listening to. And I think it's useful to talk about it, but I don't want to get into a situation where I'm saying, oh, by the way, you're just being brainwashed. It's all false propaganda. I believe it is, but that's not, I need these lessons. I don't need that sort of situation. But basically, when I see some of the things he's coming out with, you can see that people are being influenced also in China. I made that video about the jingoism from the Chinese government. No one's calling that out. Why are we not talking about Chinese racism against the West? Like this Western phobic attitude that they're taking, and this odious way that they're even boasting about the rest of the world should follow our example. I mean, it was their example that caused this in the first place. It doesn't matter if there's no new cases in China now, if things are starting to get under control in China. This whole thing began in China, and it was their failure to enforce actually pre-existing laws on these wet markets that was one of the factors in that. By the way, talking about cultural practices is not racist either. If someone says, "Oh, the Chinese are barbaric; they all eat wild animals, and this has caused this thing," that's racist because it's a generalization and it's saying, all these people are backward. But it is irrefutable that this culture exists in China. I've seen it directly. I haven't seen the wet markets, but I've seen some of the markets that serve, well, to put it bluntly, dogs. And it's a reality. Okay, you cannot make a racist statement about something that is simply a fact. Racism is prejudice about people due to their ethnicity, jingoism due to where they're from, um, and many Chinese know that there is an issue with those markets. They themselves denounce them and are often embarrassed by them. So racism would be saying all the Chinese are involved in that. But it is not racist to say actually there is a problem there. And China, for its part, and Chinese people need to, for their part, distance themselves from this and denounce it. So, if, for example, this whole thing comes to an end at some point, as it will, and nothing changes in terms of the wet markets, then frankly, China as a nation cannot complain about negative stereotypes if as a nation and as a society people are not. What I would like to see is Chinese themselves turning against these wet markets and denouncing those who are involved in them. I mean, it's disgraceful. Pretty much anything that moves is brought into those markets. That needs to be absolutely stamped out. The Chinese government made a commitment to it after the SARS outbreak, but they didn't really enforce it, certainly not sufficiently. So clearly they need to do a lot more. I mean, SARS was what, 16 years ago? So 17 years ago. So I do think that culture matters. And where there are cultural practices that are having a negative effect on public health, having a negative effect on animal welfare, having a negative effect on creating a situation that can lead to a pandemic, which has happened here, then criticizing that is not racist. And it kind of angers me when people have that knee jerk reaction that it is. Generalizing the Chinese people is racist, but criticizing particular cultural practices is not. It's just not. So each government should be judged on how it responds to the crisis. But like I said before, this is not a time for the Chinese government to be pointing fingers or to be trying to play the victim. They are largely responsible for what's happened. They're not responsible for how other governments respond, but they are responsible for creating the circumstances that allowed this thing to happen in the first place. So that's my take. I'm disgusted by the racist attacks. I've seen a Malaysian student who was beaten up by some yobs for his appearance. There was a Chinese girl in Birmingham, or Solihull to be precise, and her and her Indian friend were targeted actually by a group of Asians, British Asians, South Asians. So we shouldn't always assume, by the way, these racist attacks are white racists. They could well be Indian racists or black racists targeting the Chinese. Very often when we talk about racism, there's an assumption that it's white racists. No, you can have Indian racists against the Chinese. You can have, in fact, I don't want to detract here, but one of the ugliest, most vitriolic sentiments I've seen in recent times, actually, was from a UKIP councillor, Swale Council in Kent. She's of Sri Lankan descent, a brown skinned woman. She came out, and this is nothing to do with the virus, but it's just to give an example. She said that everyone who voted Remain are traitors who should be hanged, executed Saudi style. She showed no remorse. She said, if you don't like it, you don't have to vote for me. That's the sort of ugly sentiment that was coming from her. And I looked at her timeline, it's full of bile. She's a dark skinned woman and she's coming out with this stuff. So let's not assume that all racist attitudes must be from white people. That's ridiculous. Like I say, the incident in Birmingham was Asian racist, and I think the press need to report that because otherwise they're going to stir up racial tensions and make Chinese people think it's only the whites that don't like us. Racism is ugly, whoever is promoting it. In terms of Trump's rhetoric, um, yeah, the knee-jerk thing about foreigners is certainly there's always been a jingoism about Trump, without question. But I think focusing on the fact he called it the Chinese virus is misguided. I think the Democrats need to be focusing rather on his handling of it, his mixed messages, his reckless behavior, his dismissal of experts. That's what they need to be focusing on. Electorally speaking, it gives some hope for the Democrats. That sounds almost cynical to just think about politics, but um, I mean, Biden and Sanders to me showed a lot more leadership in their rhetoric than Trump has done. um, because they're focusing on how this needs to be dealt with in terms of medical provision, in terms of how the state responds, rather than just dismissing experts, which is what Trump's been doing. Um, and again, whatever good may be happening now, that was his initial attitude. I don't think him blaming the Chinese government is racist. I don't think you can be racist against the Chinese regime. But it is playing games when the real issue here is a pandemic. Um, I mean, what I'm saying is it's legitimate for Trump to criticize the Chinese government, but not just because he wants to get one over on them. If Trump is saying they covered it up, that's a different matter. But with Trump, everything comes down to ego, and that's where he lacks statesmanship. But like I say, in history, wherever there has been a national crisis, the incumbent has lost the election. If we look at Herbert Hoover, 1932, the Great Depression, he lost. If we look at 1980, Jimmy Carter over that Great Recession of the late 70s and the Iranian hostage crisis, Carter lost. Um, so there is historic precedence to this, and Trump's handling of this is going to be the judgment, I reckon, for this election. It doesn't matter how good the economy is. Trump is going to be judged on how he handles the coronavirus, and so far it's been less than stellar. Um, but it isn't a case of, oh, well, a Democrat can be triumphalist. President Biden will then have to show that he is a statesman and he handles it not just to be triumphalist over Trump and the Republicans, but to bring the country together and say, this is what we're doing and this is how we're going to handle it. Um, but, restrictions on flights and so on, that is not racist. I'm not going to criticize everything Trump's done. My issue with Trump is the fact that he is so flippant about experts and the fact he very often dismisses them. He ignores his own medical advisors. It's just, to me, that is more than lacking statesmanship, it's plain reckless. So I don't think Trump has come across particularly well here. Here in Britain, I think Boris Johnson, I don't think his approach has been as bad as Trump's. I think it's probably not. I know some people have been very critical. I think Johnson has given some mixed messages, but again, it taps into this thing about dismissing experts as being part of the establishment. Johnson as a Brexiteer was very apt at that. Johnson, Gove, Farage, they were all saying, oh, the experts are just part of the establishment, let's ignore them. Now, Johnson is quoting the experts, and it's right that he does that, but, it does show how a crisis can put things in perspective of how sometimes conspiracy theories and doing two fingers to the so-called establishment is not practical. It's not. I despair that people are so short-sighted that they would actually focus on that rather than common sense, rather than thinking, well, for once, this is something we actually have to be maybe considering what they're saying. Religions, incidentally, and may as well just include this briefly, churches, mosques, and so on that are ignoring advice. I've seen evangelist Christian preachers claim there was a guy in the States was actually encouraging his parishioners to shake hands. In my opinion, he should be charged with some sort of public endangerment. And any religious so-called leaders who do that, whether it be imams, whether it be clergy, I think should be charged with public endangerment. But for the most part, mosques and churches have been responsible, at least in the UK. They have reduced numbers or closed. That's that's the right approach. Right, that's my take. Um, Thanks for watching. So, generalizing all Chinese is racist. Targeting Chinese is most certainly racist as individuals, but criticizing the Chinese government and recognizing the way they have behaved and simply like saying that Trump's description of this as the Chinese virus is racist. It's not the most helpful rhetoric, but is it racist? No, it's not.